Hey, everybody, welcome back to the program. So, last time we tried to record, we didn't really get very far because we had so many technical difficulties, but there was a lot to talk about. So, I just went on and talked about the latest in Yemen, the Gaza ceasefire that we knew from the start was really not going to hold, unfortunately. And Matt and I covered the journalists that were slain, two within 3 hours, added to Israel's roster of complete and total disgusting deaths on people who are extremely courageous and know what they're signing up for, and they go on the ground to cover all of the atrocities that are committed by Israel. And I think obviously we need to continue to allow these voices, these people there on the ground who are covering all of these things, whether they're in Syria and Lebanon and Gaza, all over occupied Palestine. We need to allow these voices to be heard first and foremost. And so to finish or kind of dive into another layer of all of the geopolitics that's happening right now is my very good friend Vanessa Beeley. She is an independent journalist. You know her very well. She's on Substack. We do our Substack thing also. We haven't had too much time lately because it's been incessant and
Yeah.
the news cycle, I mean. And obviously, I wanted to finish and really get started in our conversation of what's been happening, especially Vanessa. It's nice to see you again, but unfortunately, the Jelani attacks, what Jelani and his HTS terrorist thugs have been doing in Syria has exacerbated and has continued to exacerbate in in at a level that a lot of people don't really know because there's so much going on, I think, where people's
Mm.
attention is being split in multiple ways. So I just want to hear from you the latest. I know yesterday there were the internet was down earlier, and there was also renewed attacks by Israel as well on top of the attacks from HTS. This is on the
Yeah.
civilian population in Syria. Could you dive deep into what's truly happening there at the moment?
Yeah, well, you're right. The internet was completely down this morning, and actually, phone calls, no one could make calls or connect on the internet this morning for a few hours. Friends here in Lebanon who were trying to get hold of their families and friends in Syria were obviously panicking because in the last 10 days, Al Qaeda or HTS basically have been sending their various derivatives, in other words, the terrorist groups under their control, whether they're foreign mercenaries or actual Syrian fanatics, to block the majority of the connecting roads between the main cities on the coast, and also to block the roads that would provide any escape from those cities, so mostly Latakia, Tartus, Jableh, on the coastal area to Damascus and to the various smuggling borders that have enabled some of the minorities, the majority of which are Alawites, to escape into Lebanon, into northern Lebanon, into Akka. So all of those roads have been shut down. Warnings have been put out by HTS saying that anyone trying to escape by either the official border, which is close to Tartus, or by the smuggling borders into Lebanon are going to be executed. And so basically what they've been doing is kettling the coast and, preventing any entry or exit, setting up roadblocks, bringing in heavy machinery, which of course we know they're also using to dig the mass graves. And we know there are figures being bandied around by people in Syria of around 20,000 in that area alone. And you have to remember, it's not only a coastal strip, it's also going into central Syria, into Homs, into Masyaf, close to the border with Lebanon. So it's a fairly extensive area of Syria that is being affected by these ethnic cleansing programs. I've heard in the last 48 hours that Skenbia, which is one of the Orthodox Christian towns that resisted for 14 years the Al-Qaeda advances and ethnic cleansing threats before, at least 40 of the young men have been killed. Many others have been taken into HTS prisons, where, of course, we have to assume they're either eventually going to be killed or they're being horribly tortured. Houses in Skelbia are being requisitioned by HTS. In other words, they're running a kind of a takfiri project along the lines of the Zionist project, in that they're driving out the inhabitants from their homes and villages, and then they're occupying those homes and villages. And a statement was put out, which was recorded by the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, saying that basically, if the Alawites don't come back to their homes, then they don't have any right to return. So basically, where have we heard that before? Either they come back and get slaughtered, or they stay in diaspora and they lose the right to return to their homes and their villages on the coast. So, what we're seeing right now is a project very much along the lines of the Zionist settlement project on the coast in that whole section of Syria, to change the demographic to a Sunni extremist settlement project. At the same time, as you rightly mentioned, Israel has been advancing in the south of Damascus. In the last couple of days, there have been artillery shelling and shooting of civilians in a village called Koya, which is close to the border with the occupied Golan Heights, kind of southwest of Daraa. And at the same time, they've been bombing what they describe as military installations in the south. And 3 a.m. this morning, they bombed the former Syrian military bases in Palmyra and the T4 base, which both of them are in central Syria to the east of Homs. Now, I want to get into more depth on this, but what is very interesting is that Turkey has effectively been moving its own forces and equipment into those two bases in support of HTS. And I think for people to fully understand, what Israel wants in Syria is a fragmented Syria. If we go back to the clean break doctrine of 1997, this was what that doctrine wanted to happen. That was the agenda. They want all of the regional Arab states to be divided into statelets that Israel can better control and extend its influence into. Turkey has an agenda to have what it calls a unified Syria under the control of its Muslim Brotherhood Al-Qaeda proxies. In other words, under the control of Jolani and the Syrian National Army, which was formerly the Free Syrian Army. So again, Free Syrian Army, the so-called moderate rebels working alongside Al-Qaeda under the control of Turkey. And so this is where we're seeing a developing conflict between Turkey and Israel, which of course brings Russia into the picture. And again, we can come on to that in more detail. But that, I think, is what we're seeing right now. The fact that Israel has actually bombed two sites that were formerly Syrian military bases and air bases, but are now effectively occupied by Turkey directly and by Turkish proxies is very clear. Everyone's kind of slightly trying to play it down right now, including the Israelis, actually, in some of their kind of research centers. They're trying to say, yeah, but we're not in conflict with Israel. But clearly that is a developing arena of conflict inside Syria.
It's very sad because it's like, unfortunately, the vultures are coming for what's left of Syria, and now you see, them circling. And there are a few things here, a few different layers that I want to get into with you. There is obviously the ongoing protests against Erdogan, right? Where reported millions of people in the entire country, at least hundreds of thousands in multiple cities, have gone out and protested against him, reportedly because he tried to arrest and jail his most popular rival who is far more popular than he is. However, from what I know, that
Yeah.
is not occurring alone in this sort of isolation. What we also have, obviously, is everything you mentioned regarding Israel's interest in Syria, and
Mm,
also on top of that, the Russian issue, because Russia has been reliant on Ankara for a while now, right? Due
mm,
to the
yeah.
corridor. And now what we're seeing is, in the background, there was the advocacy for Russia to keep its bases uh, from Israel, and they advocated this to the United States government. And Israel has been having meetings with Moscow as well while this is all
Hmm.
happening. And also, there's Moscow's intent to develop economic and cooperative relationships with the new Syria that's
Mm,
recently come out. And I've mentioned some of this before in my article. You've mentioned it many times. And now we're here talking about it because with what's happening against Erdogan, a lot of people are saying, oh, this is just because, he's unpopular, and he is, or because of they people actually support his rival, and that may very well be true, but the timing of these things never ceases to surprise me, right? Amaze
yeah.
me in some ways. I don't buy the timing, especially when we know that the Russian troops have also begun surrounding the Kamim Air Base, and we've seen this happen. Now, the last thing I want to point out before you dive into this is that people are saying, "Oh, good, the Russians are coming to save the
Yeah.
Syrians, to help the Syrians. They're coming in to save the day, right?" But are they really, when they have this growing and very long-standing relationship with Israel? And when we
Yeah.
heard uh Vladimir Putin agree with Donald Trump, even though the Kremlin didn't publish that, which I want to hear your opinion as to why they didn't publish it, but it was on a Russian state funded media, that he agreed with Donald Trump that Iran should not have nuclear weapons. Well, we all know Israel has them. So, just your thoughts on these multiple points of connections.
Yeah, first of all, coming to Turkey, I mean, I'm really not an expert on Turkey, but I've been speaking to a number of people, including opposition members, in the last 2 or 3 days, and a few people have kind of reached out to me on social media and have given me a number of insights, some of them opposing. So it's like I'm still trying to disentangle the whole lot. But I think that some of the points that I took away, first of all, there's no viable opposition in Turkey. They're all supported by NATO and the West and the US and the EU, or they're influenced by Mossad. There's no real anti-imperialist viable opposition inside Turkey. Imamoglu himself, yeah, he's being pushed by Western media, in particular by EU media, as being, the most popular candidate challenging Erdogan for presidency. When in fact, the reality is, unless Erdogan can change the constitution, which of course leads me to the fact that Erdogan himself could be creating this situation, because he wants to bring in a state of emergency, which gives him, I think, then the powers to be able to change aspects of the constitution, which would extend his presidency beyond the next 3 years, right? So there is potential that Erdogan himself is engineering this kind of instability, right? And also, of course, to be able to get rid of some of his opposition and so on. I mean, at the end of the day, again, this is what I understand from what people are telling me. It's a bunch of mafia warlords that are fighting over power in Turkey, and Erdogan is very much one of those. At the same time, what people have told me is that the biggest threat, from their opinion, this is from an opposition member, is the fact that, of course, because Erdogan's been running this war against Syria since before 2011, because he was incubating the terrorist factions inside Turkey, they told me there's up to 12 million Takfiri elements in Turkey right now. That includes around 6 million. Their figures are a bit higher than the official figures. So even if we go from 12 down to 8 million, whatever it is, it's a large number. But they told me 12 million. And those include Chechens, Uyghurs, Afghanis, Syrian Takfiris, and so on. The danger with any of these kind of, as they're being described, Arab Spring type events, is that those elements see an opportunity to take control of the streets. I'm not aware of seeing that yet, but that again is a huge worry. And then, of course, what happens? The borders become insecure. Turkey becomes an unstable neighbor to Syria, which, of course, who does that benefit? That certainly benefits Israel. I'm not sure it benefits the US and the EU right now, because Turkey fairly recently, or Erdogan, has been reaching out, offering Turkey to send peacekeeping troops to Ukraine instead of EU troops, to try and kind of reach a middle ground between what Russia wants and what the US and the EU want, right? So I'm not convinced of the US-EU benefits from destabilizing Turkey at this point. I am convinced of the benefits to Israel. And I'm also, to some degree, convinced of the benefits to Russia. Because if Russia is looking to collaborate and cooperate with Israel, and even HTS, as you mentioned, to consolidate its military bases and naval bases on the Syrian coast, which includes the capture of the Levantine gas, which Russia had exclusive rights to under the Assad government from 2013 onwards. Instability in Turkey gives Russia an even greater advantage for doing this, for achieving this with the US, because under those circumstances, Russia, to a degree, even for the US, would bring stability to the coastal area, to that Levantine coast, and impact on even the border with Lebanon, and would be obviously in cooperation with Israel, which we know are going to try and expand eastwards up the eastern border of Syria and into Iraq as far as the Euphrates. And so therefore, for the Greater Israel Project to work, which we know the Trump administration supports 100%, they can't have Turkey having the military bases in central Syria, because that will border on the David Corridor, the Israeli David Corridor. So that brings them into direct confrontation. Then I also want to come on to the Kurdish issue, because again, as I mentioned, Israel wants a fragmented Syria, and that includes an autonomous Kurdish region in the northeast, right? Erdogan has been trying to come to some sort of negotiation with the PKK. Abdullah Öcalan, who's the leader of the PKK, who's been in prison for 24 years. So actually he's now, under the Turkish constitution, he has the right to appeal for his release. And Erdogan has been negotiating with him. Öcalan put out a statement saying he would dissolve the PKK. In my opinion, this could be a move by the PKK to distance themselves from the YPG and the SDF in Syria, in order to open the way for them to have their autonomous region, because they're not connected to the PKK terrorists, right? So this, for me, could be another reason that Erdogan could have orchestrated the instability right now, because he doesn't want to do this deal. He doesn't want the SDF and the YPG to have the legitimacy to have their autonomous region, which would benefit Israel. I don't know if this is, so what's happening in Turkey is way more complicated than people are making it. Everyone's kind of saying, yeah, Erdogan's going to meet his end, the boomerang effect, and all of this. But I think they're underestimating how Erdogan plays the scene, for one thing. I mean, to be honest, he's outsmarted Russia on a number of occasions.
Yeah.
And for sure, that's why Russia is now looking to cooperate with Israel, because it sees an opportunity to push back against Turkish expansionism and prevent Erdogan having control of the gas reserves on the Syrian coast. For certain, that's what's going on also. And as you said, they want to be less dependent on Turkey for their interests in Africa, their interests in Syria, and even in Europe, of course, because Turkey, to some degree, is instrumental for the Black Sea Initiative that is currently or was under discussion in Riyadh. So I think, I don't know if I've kind of covered everything there, but I think there's a huge amount of maneuvering going on, and I think right now Russia sees itself in a better position by aligning itself with Israel than overtly with Turkey. I'm not saying it's going to cut all ties with Turkey. It will try to probably maintain some degree of trade and economic ties, as Russia always does. It has a pragmatic foreign policy. But that, of course, would also bring it closer to the United States, which is very much what we're seeing, right?
Exactly. And the only other thing that I want to touch on is, because we've talked about this, we were among the first people to talk about this, that's being largely ignored, this relationship between Russia and Israel. It's a matter of fact. It's not a matter of analysis or a matter of supposition. It is a matter of fact. In terms of the population, there's at least 1 million Russians there. It makes sense from a pragmatic sense that the Russian government wants Israel to exist. Like, if you have that perception, that's what they're thinking. Then also the stability in the region, that perception that perhaps with this there will be some more stability and perhaps an advancement towards a relationship with the United States, which they clearly want, in spite of the fact that Ukraine has been bombing their energy facilities, when the deal was that Ukraine would not do that, and Russia didn't hit back, which has been frustrating to a lot of Russian supporters online that have been saying, well, what is Russia doing? Why are they doing this? They're not understanding it because they're looking at it from an ideological perspective. Like, Russia should ideologically hit back at Ukraine because they're violating everything. And therefore, what are they doing? But pragmatically, Russia really wants to end this war. They really want to be in a good working relationship with the new Syria, because they know that the new Syria is ultimately going to be controlled by Israel eventually, if not Turkey. And they want to have a very, I would say, neutral relationship, what they consider neutral, with both Turkey and Israel. However, it is very clear to me that there is more weight being placed towards this relationship with Israel, and the way it's being promoted by some commentators and analysts that are very pro-Russia is that Russia's trying to save the Alawites, the 7,000 of them, I believe, that have been seeking refuge in the base, right? And so, do you think that for me, it's like, based on what I know about how the government and the military strategy is, I don't think it's that. I think it's just a continuation of, okay, well, we're gonna regain control of this. We're gonna work our way in. We're gonna secure our assets and our interests. And this isn't an insult. This is just the way I'm perceiving it.
I think that's a very good point. The other points, before I come on to that, I just also want to mention the fact that for Russia, It was always trying to wean President Assad off Iran and the resistance. And we saw that very much prevalent before the December international coup that finally toppled Damascus, in the sense that most people have the opinion that it was Russia pushing Assad towards the Gulf states. And of course, his final speech at the emergency summit was the opposite to what Russia would have liked to see, in my opinion, because he actually shamed all of the Gulf states for not doing more to prevent the genocide in Palestine. And so I think that's number one. I think Russia has always wanted or looked to squeeze Iran out of any influence inside Syria. So that's number one. And of course, working with Israel, that would be the intention. Secondly, we can't forget, like, Ukraine was actually training Jolani's militia in Idlib for about a year before December the 8th. Now, how did those Ukrainian special forces enter Idlib and train up Jolani? They came through Turkey, right? So at some point, Turkey was enabling Ukraine's involvement in Idlib to reinforce Jolani's militias, to give them drone technology training, etc., and at the same time recruiting those terrorist militia to go and fight in Ukraine against Russia. So there you have another two elements where Russia could very much ally itself with Israel as a priority over Iran or Turkey, right? As regards its position in the Middle East. Secondly, what you were talking about, I was told by someone who's a reliable source today, he's Syrian, still working with Russia, and he posted on Telegram that, Russia is bringing more troops and so on into Khmeimim, but this is to protect their own convoys that are moving around the base. I'm like, okay, maybe. But at the end of the day, this is a case of create the problem, provide the solution, isn't it? Like, we know that Russia had a role in the fall of Damascus, very clearly had a role, whether it was through the Doha talks or whether it goes much, much deeper than that, we still can't categorically say, but it definitely played a role in the collapse of the Syrian Arab Army and the so-called surrender and so on and so forth. Now, of course, what it's doing is providing safe haven for those minorities that eventually will come under its control if it consolidates its position in that particular coastal region. If I'm being cynical, if I'm being, humane about this, I'm thankful to Russia for providing a safe haven for up to 7,000 families and to a degree providing them with some aid and some help and so on and so forth and protecting them. At the same time, I'm quite sure that Russia sees it as a PR opportunity to say that, we're the safe hands on the coast, and therefore partitioning the coast and putting it under our control is going to be for the benefit of all of these minorities that are now being persecuted. And speaking from personal experience, I'm talking to Alawites that have either escaped after December or more recently, and all of them are saying to me, yeah, we'll go back to the coast if Russia has control. So this is how partitioning works, as I say, to a degree. And I'm not saying Russia created HTS or anything like that, but they created, to some degree, the environment in which HTS could flourish, take power, and then carry out the ethnic cleansing, which was always going to be an inevitable result of HTS coming to power, because that was their MO from 2011 onwards. We'd seen previous ethnic cleansing programs in the coastal areas before. Of course, they'd been defeated by the Syrian army back then. And so, certainly Russia should not have any illusions or have had any illusions that this would be the result of Syria falling to a power like HTS. They knew exactly what was going to happen. There's no, like, anyone who was watching Syria, let alone involved in Syria, knew that this was what was going to happen. They're not some kind of reformed, um,
Yeah.
like, good guys. They're still the bad guys. They're still the terrorists. They still have a terrorist ideology, and that's not going to change, despite what Putin said, of course, in his speech, which everybody says he was being ironic and he was, basically going to. A few people were coming out with this idea that he was setting a trap for the West by allowing HTS, etc., etc. But I think we can pretty much kind of dismiss all of those theories right now.
Well, the other thing I wanted to mention this that I forgot was I had no idea about the fact that Russia is sending oil to the new
Yeah.
Syrian
Yeah.
regime. But
Yeah.
I wasn't aware, and you made me aware of this. I was not aware that they hadn't done that for Syria
Mm.
under Assad. And I was completely surprised because I had assumed that with the military relationship with fighting the terrorists together all these years, that was one of the
Mm.
benefits for Syria. But it seems that they were only receiving the oil from Iran and not Russia. Can you just touch on that?
Yeah, I mean, from my experience on the ground, that was a huge criticism of Russia. I still actually haven't dug deep into it to see if there is any actual either rebuttal of that idea or evidence that they didn't provide um, oil and fuel. I know that they did provide fuel to the Syrian Arab Army forces that were working in direct collaboration with Russia, and that included some of the Orthodox Christian National Defense Forces. But as far as I know, and from what I heard from on the ground, no, they were not supplying anything for domestic use. And actually, I mean, this is anecdotal, but I do remember having a conversation with members of what was then the kind of reconciliation team, Russian team, fairly recently in the last year. And they were asking me directly, they said, like, what can we do that's constructive towards helping the Syrian people? And I was like, well, you could start helping reconstruct the electricity power plants that have been damaged in 14 years of war. You could develop the gas reserves off the coast. And so basically, I was running through what were to me very obvious actions that Russia could have taken that wouldn't really have cost it a huge amount to actually do something constructive to provide energy for an energy deprived society in Syria, because of course the US is occupying their resources in the northeast and depriving them of energy, effectively fuel and energy. And the response was, oh, no, 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 we're not thinking about something like that. We're thinking more of kind of food aid parcels and stuff like that. If you can just tell us the areas where the government is not providing effective aid and food supplies and so on. Like, seriously? So you really just want to send trucks in with a bunch of food aid parcels that has Russia on it and then film it? And and I'm sorry, I'm being cynical here, but really that was how I felt, because I actually had an invitation. If you want to come to XYZ and you can see us deliver the food aid and so on. I was like, seriously? Like, most people don't need food aid. They need electricity, they need water, they need fuel, they need heating, they need dignity, they need the absolute basic necessities of life. And honestly, Russia's in a position to have provided them. Certainly since, let's say, 2018, 2019, when the majority of Syria was liberated. They could have stepped in then and provided that construction help and infrastructure repair help that would have really benefited the Syrian people, and they didn't.
And when I found this out, that really makes a lot of sense in the context
Yeah.
of what where they were looking to strategically, or whether Syria was seen as a lost cause because of Assad's inflexibility with Erdogan and with the Gulf, whatever. Whether it was just draining too much of the resources with the war in Ukraine,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, it does point to not a desire to just rebuild it without nothing in return. There's this idea that China, Russia, and the giants just constantly do that they don't work with Israel, when we've seen very well that
No, but they do.
nobody in the international community really, except a very like 3 countries, have denounced Israel to the point of having zero relationship with them, which is what would need to happen for them to stop
Yeah.
literally killing everybody. There needs to be, and David Miller talked about this too on Twitter, there needs to be some sort of actual punishment, consequence, accountability towards Israel. And we know that they suffer economically, and that would hurt them at the very least. But even militarily, at a point, when we talk about what for example Ansarallah has been doing, they're the only ones really lately that have been really pushing at Israel where it hurts them the most. And this is why they're being so punished by the West, particularly the UK and the United States, because the UK and the United States know very well that it's also affecting them and their
Yeah.
financial sector. So it does really say so much about what those strategic interests were in Syria then, if nothing was done at that point. It also says, of course, as you alluded to earlier, the involvement um, of Russia in the fall of Syria. And we know, we discussed this with the Turkish uh, diplomat who also
Yeah.
alleged this as well. And he, when
Yeah.
he said it, everybody thought, oh, this is just some Turkish, BS. But it turns out that it's actually makes a lot of sense when you're seeing the on the ground developments happening right now.
Well,
And
and also don't forget that Russia turned back the Iranian reinforcements that were allegedly agreed between Putin and Assad, but Russia actually turned them back. I know we've mentioned that before. I think also, we've talked about this before. I think Putin probably saw or sees the Middle East as too unstable, too fractured, too under attack for him to invest any more resources other than simply consolidating his coastal positions, right? And I think that's a very real part of this. I mean, another person said to me, yeah, but you can't expect Russia to have any other policy right now. And my response was, yes, I agree with you from a realpolitik perspective, but this policy existed before December the 8th, in my opinion. And I think it would be kind of foolish to say it all began on December the 8th, and that's when Russia suddenly pivoted to Israel. It doesn't happen like that. For one thing, Russia takes a very, very, very long time to make a move and to make alliances and to switch positions. Right? It doesn't do anything fast or from a reactionary perspective. So this was planned, in my opinion, for some time. And when I look back at the actions of Russia, even in Syria, I would say there was always a potential for this to happen. When I actually look back and review it in the light of what has happened, Russia's constant support really for Israel and Turkey and Syria, both. When Lavrov offered condolences to Turkish military that had illegally entered Syria and got killed, instead of offering condolences to Syria for the loss of their soldiers under Turkish drone fire, he offered condolences to the Turkish military that had illegally invaded a sovereign country. We know that they communicated with Israel, that sometimes they shut off their radar to enable Israeli strikes on Syrian positions. So, the amount of intelligence exchange between Russia and Israel had been a long-standing issue in Syria anyway. Of course, they had to have it to some degree to protect their positions and not to enter into conflict with Israel. But that partnership was there and has been there, as you said, within Russia itself for some time.
Yeah. Well, and this is all related because I this really ties deeply into what's happening between Russia and the United States and
Mm,
Ukraine. Obviously, it's Zelensky is clearly not in power. Zelensky's been pushed out entirely from these negotiations. It's shameful. You almost feel bad for the guy because he's clearly not in these conversations right now. And
mm,
we've talked about Donald Trump and how he likes to negotiate. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, Ukraine hasn't really respected much of anything. But what a lot of people were saying that, for example, the EU doesn't want these negotiations to go through, that they have been demanding and making things more
mm,
difficult. The reality is that the Trump administration's foreign policy was the one demanding for these troops to also be there. They've been pushing this sort of tug and
mm.
pull with Russia, and it's actually very unilateral. It's still the same type of bullying attitude. It's just extremely aggressive and
Yeah.
disrespectful. But in spite of all of that, you see Russia sticking to their guns and trying to move forward with this, even though sometimes the media here will downplay it and say, no, well, we don't
Mm,
know. We're
mm.
not going to talk about this. This is what did Dmitry Peskov say today? We're not
Yeah.
going to talk about the meeting that just went on because it was technical. It's a technical situation, which is
Not quite
very,
sure what that means, but
yeah. What does that even mean? What do you mean? This is like everybody is waiting to hear if this is going to go through or not. But one of the things that recently happened was that Russia is welcoming now Trump's plan to reinitiate resume the Black Sea grain
yeah.
initiative, and Russia is welcoming
Mm,
that as well. And this is, of course, they're saying, oh, this is good because this is going to provide 100 million people grain, and it's going to help everybody. And this is, how Russia puts all of this out there. This is actually a really good thing. And they always go along with the UN this, the UN that, the UN charter, and all of this diplomacy. Meanwhile, though, what we're seeing is Russia, who should be coming at this as the powerful, from the powerful position, the position of power that has advanced in Ukraine, has continued to gain territory,
mm,
has embarrassed the EU, and we
mhm.
know that the United States didn't care about, screwing the EU either. We know that they really actually meant to
No.
do that, diminish their competition, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, Russia in this position of power, having the upper hand, seems to be sort of just being like, okay, we'll see what you say. We'll go along with you. And this is where people come in with their theories that Russia's playing 5D chess, that they're going to come in and they're just going to say no to Donald Trump. They're just going to say bye and walk away and not give in to all of this. But for me, understanding everything we just talked about and understanding exactly this pragmatic strategic approach, Russia doesn't want, they do not like conflict. They literally do not like conflict. They do not
Mm.
like chaos. They always try to maintain some sort of order. And when you go to understand the government, even at the level of the bureaucracy that is so crippling in many ways, where you have to like go back to 100 years and file a paper and then go to another place and file another paper just to do a basic thing, that has a lot of steps and it's very bureaucratic. But that shows you that there's a certain organizational method to their madness, right?
Yeah.
And they don't want things to be everywhere. If one thing goes off, it's like oh my gosh, we can't have this. So it's kind of like they're very flexible as a people, and I'm talking here culturally as well in general, but at the same time there is a disdain for this sort of chaotic craziness that we see happen in Latin America, that we see happen in West Asia, even culturally at that level. So
Yeah.
when these negotiations with the US are happening and there's a possibility to end the war in Ukraine, to lift the sanctions, which I know Russia is asking for, obviously, they're going to demand the sanctions be lifted. When they're having these relationships with Israel, which we know that they're discussing West Asian politics, we know they're discussing the Iran nuclear energy program, the potential for all of that to go. We know that they're discussing Latin America, and we know what Donald Trump's doing right now with Latin America and how he's exacerbated the situation. What I see is just a complete and total shift in terms of what people thought Russia was as an anti-imperialist resistance like a player when they're actually not, into what they really are, which is a strategic nationalist type of capitalist power that is a few decades behind the what the United States used to be, where capitalism is still building up, and it's not at the level where in the US it's in decline, but it is still pursuing that type of existence. And you see that also echoed in how they have been pushing Donald Trump, frankly, and have been
Yeah.
having this sort of favorable attitude towards this Trump administration, even though what we see is the Trump administration is coming in with very fascistic type of policies in general.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite extraordinary, and you're right. I mean, this whole meeting in Riyadh about the Black Sea Initiative, and then everyone was sort of picking up this idea that a report was going to be put out, and then Peskov suddenly saying, "Yeah, no, we're not going to because it was too technical." Like, I don't quite get that. Like, what's technical about basically renewing an initiative that had already existed, right, to provide the safe shipping of fertilizers and foodstuffs into the global markets that had been deprived since March 2022, right, in theory. It doesn't quite make sense for me. And then everyone, as you said, is pushing out the idea that yes, but the meeting was very favorable. And I think it's also interesting that Saudi Arabia is so pivotal to these meetings and these discussions. Yeah. Right? Again, that kind of reinforces what we've been saying, that it was Russia that was pushing towards Gulf state allegiances for Syria. And of course, what would that mean by default is normalization with Israel and the acceptance of the state of Israel. And again, that demonstrates Russia's, let's say, cooperation with the Gulf states that have effectively, whether officially or not, normalized with Israel. And so it's another demonstration of where Russia stands. And I think just by seeing how they're positioning themselves from that respect, it's very clear that they're pivoting towards the United States, because you can't separate Israel and the United States. And to a large degree, you can't separate Saudi Arabia and UAE and Qatar and so on from the United States and Israel. So it wouldn't make sense, particularly if, I think what is also really important is to come back to this idea of Russia maintaining influence in the Middle East, and it can only do that through Israel. It could do it potentially through Turkey, but to a lesser degree and with less stability, in my opinion. And so therefore, what does it need? If it needs Israel, it needs the US. Right? So I think that's, yeah, exactly. Well, it's going to isolate Iran, and it's going to isolate China to some degree. I think China is perfectly capable of doing its own deals and of handling the situation. It's invested so heavily globally in trade and economic centers and hubs like the ports in Greece and Europe, in the occupied territories. In Haifa, of course, it has invested in Israeli businesses also. But yeah, it isolates Iran. And I think what we're looking at is there is potential for a war with Iran. I'm still not entirely convinced by this. I know Trump is banging the drum. I know that he's blaming Iran for everything that's happening in Yemen, although there is absolutely no excuse for Trump to be going to war with Yemen, except for, of course, the security of Israel, yet again, as you mentioned. But I think they also know, I don't know if they're crazy enough to actually allow Israel to drag them to war with Iran, because the impact on global economy is going to be quite huge. It's not the same as bombing Yemen, or which is potentially going to impact on Saudi Arabia long term, but not really globally, because if they manage, and I don't think they're going to at all, if they manage to decimate Yemen, they have control of the Red Sea, and they also have control of Yemen's resources and the potential to bring the oil from Yemen and Saudi Arabia through the southern coastline of Yemen, avoiding the Straits of Hormuz. So I can understand the war against Yemen from a sort of a Trump trader policy point of view, right? I can't understand the war with Iran because they have control of the Straits of Hormuz. They can bomb the Gulf state oil facilities immediately and cut supply to the world, increase the cost of oil, cost of fuel, and so on, right? There's too much to lose. You've got a country of 90 million, an army of 1 million. And you've also got a very divided country between the resistance and the reformists, or those that are pivoting towards normalization with Israel and the West again. Iran isn't Iran of 1979. It's not Yemen. It's made it even Iran has made it clear that it's not Yemen. It doesn't have control over Yemen's reactions and Yemen's policy. No one does. It's not a proxy of Iran. It's very different to Iran. It's like Iran from the late 1970s during the revolution. The population is united behind the resistance on behalf of Palestine, basically, and against imperialism and colonialism. In Iran, no. You have a huge sector of society, which was demonstrated by the election of Pezeshkian, that don't want to go to war on behalf of Palestine or on behalf of the resistance. And we've seen that. We've seen Iran vacillating between attacking, not attacking, negotiation with Trump and no negotiation with Trump. We're seeing the division playing out real time, particularly since, of course, Trump was responsible for the assassination of Soleimani and Mohandes, the leader of the PMU in Iraq. And then, of course, there was the assassination, I'm certain, of Raisi and Abdul Hayyan, the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran. It's been tested. And I think the division has been seen very clearly.
So, but then in that case, wouldn't this be the best moment to target such a divided Iran on that note?
To target militarily or to target with internal regime change?
Internal regime change. That's where I'm thinking is where the United States
I think that's the more likely policy. I think Trump is kind of using the smoke and mirrors tactic of Iran in capital letters when he's talking about Yemen, suggesting that they will go down the road with Israel to a war with Iran. But I'm not even convinced Israel wants a war with Iran. I think Israel would far rather have a successful regime change towards a regime that would be at least favorable with normalizing relations with Israel and turning a blind eye to Israel's expansionism. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, well, it would be easier, right? I mean, it would just be easier for everybody. And with somebody like Pezeshkian and the population so divided, and the fall of Syria and everything happening right now in Syria, against Yemen, in Gaza, the just resurgence of
Mm-mm.
this genocide that really never
Yeah,
stopped. I think this is the perfect opportunity if you're of these people, right? I think that's where
yeah,
they're looking at. And
yeah.
one of the things that I know has annoyed you and annoys me is this idea of, the hopium part. And again, we're not trying to bring people down. We're trying to bring people to reality, to really assess the
Mm,
situation at hand, not what we want things to look like. Because if I wanted things to look like, they wouldn't look anything like this. None of this would have happened. Syria wouldn't have followed.
exactly.
That we wouldn't be in this scenario that unfortunately we are. And we have to deal with what's happening at the moment and really put the pieces together as to how we got here so we can see
Hmm.
ahead. And what I'm seeing is this just desire to say, oh, Israel's falling apart. The US is just falling apart right now. They're it's a matter of time. They're going down. They're completely powerless. Multipolarity is here. We're winning. The Russia and China are going to save us all. And I think we're falling into that same trap of just really hoping that somebody saves us and hoping that, these
It's not gonna
government
happen.
entities do something that really just doesn't make
Yeah.
any sense from a real politic point of view.
Look, I mean, I said this on UK column recently, but if you're really going to put your hope in the billionaire class, you're hopeless because they're never going to have our best interests as the plebs at heart. Like, we're just pawns on their grand chessboard, basically. And I think, yeah, I have been getting frustrated with this idea that Israel is just going to implode and go away. Like, yes, of course, there's a possibility for there being some kind of civil war in Israel between the far, 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 far right extremist sectors like Ergun and Stone Gang that are re-emerging, basically, and the far, far right, because there's no left and there's no center in Israel. It's all extremist
Yeah.
policy, even amongst the population. Um, yeah, there is potential for civil war between, the Samaria and Judea, the Ergen, Stern, the Ben Gvir types, and the Knesset and the state. Yes, but I guess my point is what is Israel? Israel isn't the beating heart of the Zionist movement. It's an instrument. It's an instrument of U.S. hegemony. Previously, it was UK hegemony. It was then adopted by the United States, basically. But it's also a tool of the Zionist movement hegemony and supremacy and globally. And my fear is that we focus too much on the destruction of Israel as an entity. I mean, at the end of the day, what is it? It's a military outpost for the United States. It's an intelligence gathering operation for the United States and its allies. It's an interference instrument for the United States. It's a military bulwark there to provide an obstacle to Chinese expansion, Iranian expansion, Russian expansion, the Belt and Road Initiative, etc., extending instead to the India Middle East Economic Corridor, which is going from Mumbai through the Gulf states, through the occupied territories into Egypt, and then to Europe, and so on. This is what Israel is. So if Israel falls apart tomorrow and descends into civil war, it's a population of 6 million. What's going to happen? The US will take over. The US is already basically taking over. It's supplying the air defense. It's setting up its own military outpost there. It's been developing its own military and air-based presence in Israel for some time under the radar to a large degree. It has huge bases there, in fact, in the Negev desert. And it will just be taken over as a US Zionist movement project, right? This is my opinion again, but I was discussing this with David Miller today, and he has the same frustration, is that, again, there's this element of hopium is like, yeah, we'll just wait for Israel to basically collapse. Well, okay, Israel collapse, you've still got the US. So you need both of them to collapse in order for for the threat to the region to end. And then it's not going to end because the US government, the UK government, the EU government, and virtually every government in the West is occupied and captured by the Zionist movement. So it's not going to end, even if that happens, right? Because we're not, in my opinion, we're not fighting the bigger enemy, which is the
The
Zionist
root.
movement. Yeah, the root.
Yeah.
We're cutting off
And it's
like
not
one of
even,
the heads of the Hydra, which is Israel,
yeah.
basically. That's what we're talking about. And I'm afraid that we get distracted by that and we're not focusing on the bigger threat to the whole world, not just to West Asia and Iran and Russia and China, etc., is basically this Zionist movement empire, which is going on right now.
Well, which is being normalized by the Gulf, and we see Russia
Yeah.
still obviously having these relationships. So it's not just the West, and that's been my whole
No,
point
no.
too. It's not just the West that obviously the West vocally and flagrantly supports Israel financially. We're not saying Russia does that, but there is that relationship and there is that potential, and ultimately it's more than Israel. It's a Zionist movement that is so powerful in the United States. I mean, it is
Yeah.
so powerful
Yeah.
that they're now implementing laws to go after people who speak out against Israel. And that is fascistic. And that
Exactly.
might be something that Americans in the United States are affected by, where they're like, wait a minute, because they voted for Trump, a lot of them, because he was going to get rid of censorship. He was going to get rid of the Biden era of fascism, where they, take you down if you say the COVID vaccine was experimental, or if you said something about the election or something. So they came in saying, oh, Trump's going to support free speech. We have Kennedy, we have Tulsi, blah, blah, blah. We're going to ignore everything about them.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we're going to ignore all of that. Let's hope.
Yeah.
And then, Trump comes out appointing a pro-COVID vaccine CDC head. He comes in, a Gabbard flips the 180 on Yemen. You have just every facet of the Trump administration entirely embedded in Zionism, not just Miriam Adelson money, but literally in every facet.
Yeah.
And so you have pretty much a descending, yes, U.S. into full-on more fascism that eventually, once they get tired of using it on foreigners, it's going to come down on the people of the United States.
Yeah.
But you still have these people, and I'm not going to name names, but you have these geopolitical analysts that are very well known saying, but the United States is not Israel, and the United States is we, they have these ideals of democracy, these ideals that were founded on the Constitution, and we need to be proud of that. And this patriotism, this jingoism, for me, has never just gelled with the reality of being anti-empire. If you're anti-empire, for me, how do you justify being so patriotic about a country that was literally funded on genocide and slavery? I mean,
Exactly.
where do we think Israel got it from? Hello?
Yeah, and like this whole sloganing of "Make America Great." Well, no, like, why doesn't America repair the damage it's done in the world, and then it might be considered great? But what does "Make America Great Again" mean? What was its greatness? Its greatness was, as you said, genocide, and it's been at war for the majority of its existence, destroying other countries that pose absolutely no threat to America. No, I'm equally fed up with this. It's not taking into account the role that America has played in effectively the destruction of much of the global South, and the absolute kind of regression of any development of underdeveloped countries. And it's not had a single positive effect on the world, or even, I would say, and I'm not speaking from huge experience, even internally. Like, what is America now compared to whatever it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago? And I would say the same about the UK, by the way. I mean, UK is heading towards Victorian level poverty. It's absolutely no different. It's up to its eyeballs in debt. I mean, the Ukraine situation is as Alex Craner has talked about many times, is has the potential to destroy the UK economy. It's being kept afloat. It's being put on life support by the Bank of England, but that's going to crash at some point. So it's no different. I'm not having a go at America over and above what the UK has contributed to all of this. Also, both globally, but also in the kind of creation of the state of Israel, on the genocide of the Palestinians. It's no different. But I would never say make the UK great again, because if I look at the UK, it's like, when was it great? When it was destroying India, when it was destroying the Middle East, when?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't understand. I don't understand that mindset, really. I mean, you have to have something to be proud of in order to be proud. And you can even
Yeah.
argue, well, maybe it's, the people there, they mean whatever, but I mean, we have the most propagandized population there is. So most of the people don't care about anything until it affects them. And that's just how
Yeah.
we've been created and bred and completely, raised to not really care and to be just on survival mode now, because that's where everybody is right now in the West, is survival mode. Things are ridiculously expensive. The price of eggs is insane. This seems insane, but the price of eggs, it just tells you, like, people, if that continues, people might actually do something. I don't know, because it's
Maybe.
insane. And being away from it all kind of gives you a bit of a clear picture as to why, how it maintains itself, and really realistically, that's going to take some time to go down. And it's not something as easily as just saying multipolarity every 5 seconds and thinking, it's magically going to go away. Multipolarity. It's not. We don't have a magical wizard that's just going to take down the US and take down Israel, especially when we have such a disjointed, non-aligned axis that's really not aligned. I mean, if Iran does fall to some sort of manipulation, some sort of color revolution of sorts, then that leaves a lot of people extremely vulnerable. The fall of Syria left a lot of people extremely vulnerable. Russia's normalization with the West is leaving a lot of people extremely vulnerable. We see what Trump is trying to do to Venezuela.
Yeah, exactly.
25% tariffs on anybody that buys oil from Venezuela.
Which is exactly like the Caesar sanctions, remember? Because Trump brought in the Caesar sanctions on Syria, which penalized anyone that came even with humanitarian aid to Syria. So it's no different. It's the same tactic. It's just differently packaged. But yeah, I mean, that's just insane. And it's not legal under any kind of international law. Like, how can another country actually tell another sovereign country, no, you can't buy from this country, because if you do, we're going to charge you 25%? Like, what?
It's the mean girl in school, and she's saying, if you're friends with her, then we're kicking you out of the group. It's like,
it's just insane. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but that just sounds completely insane to me. And the fact that Trump thinks he can do it and he's going to get away with it is, that's just the epitome of the world that we're in right now. And we've got to face this world. We have to face the reality. That's the bottom line. We still manage to be positive. We can still find positivity in there somewhere, and it's very difficult sometimes. It's really hard.
Yeah.
But facing it is better than ignoring it, and then it comes to wallop you later, And with that comes all the cognitive dissonance and the depression and the like, oh, but I believed in X, Y, Z. And I don't know. For me, it's way better. It's more liberating to actually see the truth for all its kind of grubby reality than it is to believe in something that doesn't exist or isn't going to exist.
This reminds me of a meme I'll share later. Like, there's like four different kinds of people in the world. The ones that really want to see the truth and make sure others see the truth, and the ones that are stuck, and then the ones that know that they're part of like a system and of slavery, essentially, in a way.
Yeah.
And they don't care, and then they're the ones, that are the slave masters, sort of, so to speak, right? And it's like, for me, that's essentially does divide people, and this is why we're the way we are, because we're so frustrated with everything. And that's a good way to end it, Vanessa, because to see that, to
Yeah.
face the reality, I think is necessary. That doesn't mean you stop fighting or you just give up. It
No,
just,
not at
facing the
all.
reality gives you the ammunition to know how to fight what
Hmm.
you need to fight, I guess.
Yep, definitely.
So, Vanessa, thank you so much for coming on and having this discussion. We'll obviously do it again sometime soon, but let everybody know what you
Yeah.
have coming up right now in the next few days.
Well, just follow me on Substack. I'll be publishing everything there first and foremost. Telegram, of course, and X. I nearly called it Twitter again. I still can't get myself out of that. Look, I'm still based in the region, so I'm still going to be covering things from on the ground. I'm clearly not going to be going back inside Syria for a fairly long time, but certainly, I'll still be covering things from the Lebanese perspective.
Well, thank you, Vanessa, for your very good work and everything you're doing to get the stories out from especially the Syrian refugees that are coming in. I really look forward
Mm.
to hearing more about that and their experience. Everybody, make sure to follow Vanessa on Substack, X/Twitter, because we still call it Twitter, and yeah, Telegram and everywhere else. So, thanks so much for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you next time. Take care.